Hello everyone. It is time for us to discuss the health effects of lipids, and we will do so in two parts. This lecture is part 1, the next lecture will be part 2. In this presentation, we will discuss the health effects of trans fatty acids, saturated and monounsaturated fatty acids. Okay? Let's begin with trans fatty acids. Notice this quote from the American Heart Association. High levels of LDL cholesterol in your blood increase your risk of heart disease and stroke. Now, this quote gives me the basis to state that anything that would increase the LDL cholesterol, the so-called bad cholesterol, and the reason why it is called the bad cholesterol is because it increases the risk for heart disease and stroke, and believe it or not, other complications, okay? And so in this context, let's look at the health effects of dietary lipids. This graph shows us results of an evaluation of the impact of dietary trans fatty acids as well as dietary saturated fatty acids on the LDL to HDL ratio, okay? LDL to HDL ratio. Now, before I go into describing or explaining what we find here is, notice that the LDL and HDL ratio can change, increase or decrease. How? Either one of these is decreasing and the other decreasing, or both are increasing or both are decreasing, okay? Now what we find is, notice this solid line. The solid line that you see on this particular graph shows us what happens as we ingest more and more and more trans fatty acids in a diet. As the intake of trans fatty acids increases, so does the ratio of LDL to HDL. Okay? In case of trans fatty acid intake both increases the LDL cholesterol and decreases the HDL cholesterol. Okay? This is why scientists tell us that trans fatty acids have worse effect in terms of cardiovascular health or cardiovascular outcome than any other fatty acids. And I want you to remember that, okay? Please remember, trans fatty acids are worse than any other fatty acids and are the worst when it comes to the impact on our cardiovascular system. On the other hand, we also have here the analysis for saturated fat. That impact is represented by this broken line here, okay? And notice that similarly as was the case with trans fatty acids, as the intake of saturated fatty acid increases, so does the ratio of LDL to HDL. However, the impact is not as bad as it is for trans fatty acids. This is why we believe that saturated fatty acids are detrimental, but they are not as detrimental as are trans fatty acids, okay? This is why, notice, it says here on the per gram basis, the adverse effect of trans fatty acids appears to be stronger than that of saturated fatty acids. So again, please keep this in mind. And indeed, we find here in different studies that as trans fatty acids, notice, provided 2% of energy, okay, or provided 2% additional energy to a given diet, they increase the risk of coronary heart disease here, okay, in this particular case. Depending on the study, they increase the risk by 33% in the first study, 26 in the second study, 14 in the next study, and so on and so on. You see that some of the studies even showed almost 3 times as high risk. And so again, the impact is detrimental for developing and potentially dying of cardiovascular disease. This statement was written prior to the Food and Drug Administration in the United States banning all the trans fats in the United States in the food supply. Okay. However, as I mentioned in another recording, other countries are still allowing these trans fats to be used in food manufacturing. Thus, though it is not applicable to the United States, it is applicable to other countries. Okay. Also, the statement emphasizes again the role these trans fats play in the disease development, namely heart attacks and coronary heart disease. Given the 1.2 million annual myocardial infarctions and deaths from coronary heart disease in the United States, near elimination of industry-produced trans fats might avert between 72,000 in case of 6% of these events and 228,000, close to about 19% of coronary heart disease events each year. Okay, so again, in the United States, no longer food manufacturers are permitted to use these trans fats. This automatically enhanced population's health, given individuals, even if they still inject junk food, junk food is no longer containing these artificially made trans fats. Does the source of trans fatty acids matter? Remember from, again, the sources that some of the fatty acids of these trans fatty acids are found naturally in meats, and others are made or added by the manufacturer in making different products. And I have some data for you to answer this question. Data actually on a number of different studies and cases of people with different health conditions. And what we find is that both of them are detrimental, both meaning those artificial, okay, that are added to foods, as well as those found naturally. The difference is that artificial or industrial trans fatty acids, those that are added again in food making and food processing, are a little bit worse than those naturally found, but both of them are detrimental. This graph illustrates the same thing that I already mentioned. And here we have again the same thing. This is impact on HDL cholesterol, for example. And we find that with higher intake of these trans fatty acids, HDL cholesterol decreases for both industrial as well as those found naturally in ruminants, meaning, for example, cattle and dairy products. Okay. Based on everything that I shared with you in this presentation, I would like us to look at the recommendations regarding trans fatty acids intake. The first one is from the World Health Organization. Trans fatty acid intake should not exceed 1% of energy. Okay? Considering these trans fatty acids are harmful, this is a prudent recommendation. When we look at specifically recommendations from the US National Academy of Sciences, the recommendation states trans fatty acid intake should be as low as possible. Let's now turn to saturated fatty acids. And I already mentioned that they also alter the LDL to HDL cholesterol. Therefore, they are also detrimental for cardiovascular disease. And here we have the analysis for mortality. Okay. And what we find is that foods that contain naturally these trans fatty acids, this is meat and risk of mortality, okay? we find the cumulative effect of all the studies that were considered here was 17% higher mortality among those with the highest intake. And for this analysis on the right-hand side of the screen, intake of processed meats, which usually contain even more trans fatty acids, we also find the same 21% cumulative effect of all the studies, a 21% increase in mortality. Key information: processed meat intake is associated with a higher risk of detrimental health conditions such as cardiovascular disease compared to red or other type of meat intake. Okay, keep this in mind as well. Processed meat is the worst, then red meat, and white meat does not necessarily have the same detrimental impact, while fish may be beneficial. Okay, monounsaturated fatty acids and their health effects. Okay, and here we have a graph that shows intake of nuts on coronary heart disease death risk. Okay, and this is based on more than one studies, and you can see that with a higher frequency of intake of nuts, which predominantly, remember, contain monounsaturated fatty acids, with some exceptions of, for example, walnuts that predominantly contain polyunsaturated fatty acids, although they are also a relatively good source of monounsaturated. We find the reduction in coronary heart disease death risk. Now, there may be other components of nuts that contribute to this, but we know from other studies that, again, monounsaturated fatty acids have this beneficial effect. Beneficial meaning reduction in risk for cardiovascular complications. Here we have another analysis, and again we find that the higher or more frequent consumption of nuts, which here serve as a proxy for monounsaturated fatty acid intake, the lower is the risk of developing heart disease. Okay, I don't have additional data for other health conditions, but I can tell you that monounsaturated fatty acids decrease the risk for type 2 diabetes, for example. Okay, and so the focus should be on replacing processed meats and red meat with good sources of monounsaturated fatty acids, which include nuts. And by the way, nuts in addition are also a very good source of protein. And so perhaps the protein also that are found in fat will account for some of the decrease here. Nuts are a very good source of fiber. So in addition to just the good profile of fatty acids in nuts, we have again other constituents, other ingredients found in these food items that help with reduction in risk. The same goes for seeds. Again, I don't have specific data to show you, but I can tell you that, for example, adding flax seeds or sesame seeds or sunflower seeds, pumpkin seeds, reduces the risk of developing cardiovascular disease, in part because they decrease cholesterol level. Okay, and so the health effects are well documented, and we can accomplish of this very easily. Just imagine in our grocery stores we have peanut butter and almond butter and cashew butter and soya nut butter and other type of products similar to those. Okay, we have milk based on different nuts. In addition, we can munch on raw nuts, for example. We can very easily utilize these nuts in making gravies, for example. And again, the replacement of foods that are associated with detrimental health conditions, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and other unwanted, undesirable health conditions with these products will help in reduction of the risk. I will end on this. Thank you for your attention.